Major Rachel Coleman had always known that Ridgepoint Air Base operated differently than other installations. The coffee in the operations building tasted like it had been brewing since the first Gulf War. The briefing room smelled perpetually of stale cigarettes and old leather, and the commanding officers spoke in clipped sentences that left no room for questions. But it wasn't until her third week at the base that she realized how differently things really worked here. The morning started like any other. Rachel arrived at the hangar before dawn, her flight suit crisp and her gear bag slung over one shoulder. She'd been assigned to the 81st Fighter Squadron, flying close air support missions in the battered A-10 Warthog she'd nicknamed Ire Storm. The aircraft wasn't pretty, but it was reliable, and after 12 years of military service, Rachel valued reliability over everything else. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Brennan was waiting for her near the aircraft. He was a tall man with steel gray hair and the kind of posture that suggested he'd spent more time behind a desk than in a cockpit lately. His eyes were cold, calculating, and they settled on Rachel with the weight of judgment she'd grown accustomed to receiving from certain types of officers. "Coleman," he said without preamble, "we need to discuss your flight patterns." Rachel set down her gear bag and faced him directly. She'd learned early in her career that showing uncertainty was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. "What about them, sir?" "You've been flying too aggressively, taking unnecessary risks." Brennan pulled out a tablet and showed her a flight path marked in red. "This low-altitude approach you used yesterday in the training exercise, completely outside acceptable parameters." Rachel studied the screen. The flight path in question had been a textbook canyon run, the kind of maneuver that separated competent pilots from truly skilled ones. She'd executed it flawlessly, delivering simulated ordnance on target while maintaining concealment from ground-based threats. "Sir, that approach was within operational guidelines. I maintained safe separation from terrain and achieved mission objectives." "Safe separation?" Brennan's voice carried a note of condescension that made Rachel's jaw tighten. "Coleman, you were 40 feet above the deck. One wind gust, one moment of inattention, and we'd be scraping you off a mountainside. With respect, sir, the mission profile called for low-altitude penetration. I executed according to established doctrine." Brennan closed the tablet with a sharp snap. "Your version of established doctrine, maybe. But this squadron operates by my standards, and my standards prioritize aircraft preservation over showboating." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "I've seen your type before, Coleman. Hotshots who think they know better than their commanding officers. Let me be clear, that attitude will not be tolerated here." Rachel felt heat rising in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "I'm not showboating, sir. I'm flying the mission as trained." "You're flying like you have something to prove," Brennan shot back. "And that makes you dangerous. From now on, all your flight plans go through me personally before execution. No deviations, no creative interpretations. You fly by the book. My book, or you don't fly at all." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Around them, other pilots and crew members went about their morning routines, but Rachel could feel eyes watching the confrontation. Word traveled fast on military bases, and she knew this conversation would be dissected and analyzed before lunchtime. "Understood, sir," she said finally, because arguing further would only make things worse. Brennan nodded curtly. "Good. Maybe you'll last longer here than your predecessor did." He turned and walked away, leaving Rachel standing beside her aircraft. With questions burning in her mind, Captain Tom Rodriguez, her wingman, approached once Brennan was out of earshot. Tom was a steady pilot with 8 years of experience and a reputation for keeping his head down and his mouth shut. But there was concern in his eyes as he looked at Rachel. "What was that about?" he asked quietly. Rachel shook her head. "Just." The new boss establishing boundaries, I guess. Rachel, Tom's voice carried a warning tone. Brennan doesn't like pilots who stand out. The last person assigned to that aircraft, Major Kelly Hughes, she was one of the best stick and rudder pilots I've ever seen. But she and Brennan clashed constantly over tactics and mission execution. What happened to her? Tom glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. Transfer orders came through suddenly. One day she was here. The next day she was reassigned to a desk job in Colorado. Brennan said it was for career development, but everyone knew better. A chill ran down Rachel's spine. She'd worked too hard to get where she was to let some power-hungry colonel derail her career. Tom, what exactly is Brennan's problem with aggressive flying? It's not about the flying, Tom said. It's about control. Brennan runs this squadron like his personal kingdom, and he doesn't like anyone who might outshine him. He's got connections. Higher up the chain, political allies who keep him protected. Cross him, and you'll find yourself transferred to the worst assignment they can find. Rachel looked at Iron Storm, her hands clenching into fists. The aircraft represented everything she'd worked for. The chance to serve at the tip of the spear, to make a real difference in combat operations. The thought of losing that because of one man's ego was almost unbearable. There's something else, Tom continued. Brennan's been pushing for budget cuts to the A-10 program. Word is he wants to transition the squadron to drone operations. Remote-controlled missions that can be flown from climate-controlled trailers. Says it's the future of close air support. Drones can't do what we do, Rachel said, her voice tight with frustration. They can't adapt in real time, can't read the battlefield the way a human pilot can. Tell that to Brennan. He's already got half the brass convinced that manned aircraft are obsolete. Tom checked his watch. Look, I've got to prep for the morning brief. Just be careful, okay? Don't give him any ammunition to use against you. As Tom walked away, Rachel stood alone beside her aircraft. The morning sun was beginning to paint the eastern mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and somewhere in those peaks, she knew, real missions were waiting. Missions that would require every bit of skill and judgment she possessed. But first, she had to survive the political battlefield of Ridgepoint Air Base. She ran her hand along Iron Storm's scarred fuselage, feeling the rough patches where enemy fire had once found its mark. This aircraft had a history of bringing pilots home against impossible odds, and Rachel was determined to be worthy of that legacy. Whatever game Colonel Brennan was playing, she would find a way to beat him at it. The warning signs were clear. Now, Brennan wasn't just a demanding commander. He was actively working to undermine her. But Rachel had faced worse odds before, and she had something that Brennan lacked. The absolute certainty that when the real call came, she would be ready to answer it, regardless of what some desk-bound colonel thought about proper flight parameters. The question was whether she'd get the chance to prove it before Brennan found a way to remove her from the equation entirely. The confrontation came sooner than Rachel expected. 3 days after her encounter with Colonel Brennan, she found herself in the squadron briefing room facing a mission that would test every principle she'd been trained to uphold. The room was packed with pilots, intelligence officers, and support staff, all focused on the large screen displaying satellite imagery of a hostile territory designated as Grid 77. Intelligence indicates enemy forces have established anti-aircraft positions throughout this valley system, announced Major Derek Walsh, the squadron's intelligence officer. Standard approach protocols call for high-altitude ingress with standoff. Weapon delivery. Rachel studied the terrain carefully. The valley was a natural fortress with steep walls and limited approach routes. High-altitude attacks would be safer for the aircraft, but far less effective against fortified positions. The enemy would have plenty of time to take cover, and civilian casualties would be a serious concern. She raised her hand. "Sir, what about?" Low-level approach through the southern corridor. We could use the terrain masking to achieve surprise and deliver precision strikes. The room fell silent. Colonel Brennan, who had been standing near the back, stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Major Coleman, did you not understand the briefing? This is a high-altitude mission. Period. I understand the briefing, sir. I'm suggesting that the tactical situation might warrant alternative approaches. The southern corridor would allow U.S. to get shot down by the first shoulder-fired missile that locks onto your heat signature. Brennan interrupted. This isn't a video game, Major. We don't take unnecessary risks to stroke pilot egos. Rachel felt the eyes of every person in the room on her. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared uncomfortable, but none offered support. Sir, it's not about ego. It's about mission effectiveness. High-altitude strikes against hardened positions have limited success rates, especially when the enemy has advance warning. Brennan's face darkened. Are you questioning the mission planning, Major? I'm offering tactical input based on my assessment of the terrain and enemy disposition. Rachel kept her voice steady, professional, even as she felt the trap closing. Around her, your assessment? Brennan stepped closer, his voice rising. You've been at this base for 3 weeks, Coleman. 3 weeks. And you think you know better than officers who have been planning combat missions since before you learned to fly? The insult hit like a physical blow, but Rachel refused to back down. My experience is relevant regardless of how long I've been stationed here, sir. I've flown similar missions in. Enough. Brennan's voice cut through the room like a whip. Crack. Major Coleman, you will fly the mission as briefed. No deviations, no creative interpretations, no grandstanding. Is that clear? Rachel felt a dozen pairs of eyes watching her, waiting to see if she would fold under pressure. Every instinct told her to fight back, to defend her professional judgment, but she also knew that open defiance would only give Brennan the excuse he was looking for to destroy her career. Crystal clear, sir, she said through gritted teeth. Good. And Major Coleman? Since you seem to have excess energy for tactical theorizing, you'll be flying an additional patrol mission this afternoon. So, consider it an opportunity to practice following orders. The briefing continued, but Rachel barely heard the rest of it. Her mind was racing, analyzing what had just happened and what it meant for her future at Ridgepoint. Brennan hadn't just disagreed with her tactical assessment. He'd humiliated her in front of the entire squadron. The message was clear. Step out of line again, and the consequences would be severe. After the briefing, Captain Rodriguez caught up with her in the hallway. Rachel, what were you thinking in there? I was thinking about the mission, she replied, her voice tight with frustration. About doing the job we're supposed to do. The job we're supposed to do is follow orders, Tom said quietly. Even when those orders don't make tactical sense. That's not the oath I took, Rachel shot back. I swore to support and defend the Constitution, not to blindly follow incompetent leadership. Tom glanced around nervously. Keep your voice down. Look, I know you're frustrated, but Brennan has the authority here. Cross him again, and you'll be flying a desk for the rest of your career. Maybe that would be better than watching good. People die because we're too afraid to challenge bad decisions. Rachel, listen to me. Tom grabbed her arm gently. I've seen this before. Brennan destroyed Kelly Hughes the same way, piece by piece, until she had no choice but to accept the transfer. He'll do the same to you if you keep pushing. Rachel pulled away from his grip. Then maybe it's time someone pushed back. The afternoon patrol mission turned out to be exactly what Rachel expected. A pointless flight over empty desert, designed to waste fuel and keep her away from more important operations. She flew the prescribed route at the prescribed altitude, following Brennan's orders to the letter while her mind churned with frustration. But as she turned Iron Storm toward home, something caught her attention on the radio. Emergency chatter from a search and rescue operation in the mountains north of the base. A military transport had gone down in hostile territory, and the crew was trapped in terrain too dangerous for conventional rescue operations. Rachel listened to the communications. With growing alarm, the rescue helicopters were being driven back by ground fire, and weather was closing in fast. Without immediate assistance, a downed aircrew would likely be captured or killed. She changed course without hesitation, pushing Iron Storm toward the crash site. The terrain was exactly the kind of challenging environment she'd trained for: narrow valleys, unpredictable winds, and enemy forces positioned on the high ground. It was also exactly the kind of mission that Brennan would never approve. As she approached the area, Rachel could see the smoke from the crashed transport rising from a small clearing surrounded by rocky cliffs. Enemy muzzle flashes sparkled from concealed positions on the ridgelines, and the rescue helicopters were circling helplessly at a safe distance. "Ridgepoint Base, this is Storm 17, she radioed. "I have visual on the rescue operation, requesting permission to provide close air support." The response came immediately, and it wasn't from the tower. "Storm 17, this is Colonel Brennan. You are ordered to return to base immediately. Do not engage." Rachel's hand tightened on the stick. Below her, she could see figures moving near the wreckage, the aircrew still alive but pinned down by enemy fire. The rescue helicopters couldn't get close enough to extract them, and time was running out. "Sir, the aircrew is in immediate danger. I can suppress the enemy positions and clear a path for rescue." "Negative, Storm 17. Return to base now." "That is a direct order." Rachel stared down at the scene below. Every fiber of her training, every principle she'd been taught about the military's primary duty to never leave anyone behind, screamed at her to act. But she also knew that disobeying a direct order would end her career instantly and probably result in a court-martial. "Storm 17, acknowledge." Brennan's voice came again, harder this time. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. When she opened them again, her course was clear. "Storm 17 returning to base," she transmitted, her voice hollowed out. As she turned Iron Storm away from the crash site, Rachel felt something break inside her chest. She had just abandoned fellow service members to save her own career, and the shame of it burned like acid in her throat. But she also knew that this wasn't the end of the story. Brennan had won this round, but the war between them was far from over. Landing back at Ridgepoint, Rachel taxied Iron Storm to its designated spot with mechanical precision. The rescue operation was still ongoing, she knew, but without close air support, the chances of success were slim. As she climbed down from the cockpit, she found Brennan waiting for her. "Wise decision, Major," he said with satisfaction. "Perhaps you're finally learning to prioritize proper command structure over reckless heroics." Rachel faced him with eyes that could have cut steel. "Yes, sir. I'm learning a great deal about command structure." Brennan smiled and walked away, confident that he had finally broken her spirit. He had no idea that he had actually done the opposite. Rachel Coleman had just discovered exactly how far she was willing to go to protect her principles. And more importantly, she had learned that there were some battles worth fighting, regardless of the personal cost. The real war was just beginning. News about the failed rescue operation spread through Ridgepoint Air Base like wildfire. 2 aircrew members had been captured, and a third had died from wounds sustained in the crash. The rescue helicopters had been forced to withdraw when enemy reinforcements arrived, and the entire operation was being classified as a tactical failure. Rachel sat in the officers' club that evening, staring into a glass of whiskey she hadn't touched. The liquid reflected the dim overhead lights, creating patterns that seemed to mock her with their random movements. She couldn't stop thinking about the moment she turned Iron Storm away from the crash site, abandoning her fellow service members to follow Colonel Brennan's orders. "Mind if I sit?" Rachel looked up to see Captain Jennifer Walsh, the base's senior intelligence officer. Jennifer was known for her sharp mind and sharper tongue, and she had a reputation for speaking truth to power regardless of the consequences. She was also one of the few officers at Ridgepoint who seemed immune to Brennan's political maneuvering. "Free country," Rachel said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Jennifer sat down and signaled the bartender for a beer. "Heard you had an interesting day. That's one way to put it." Rachel finally took a sip of her whiskey, feeling it burn all the way down. "I suppose you're here to tell me I did the right thing by following orders. Actually, I'm here to tell you that you're not the first pilot Brennan has put in that position." Jennifer's beer arrived, and she took a long pull before continuing. "Kelly Hughes faced the same choice about 6 months ago. Brennan ordered her to abort a time-sensitive mission because it involved flying below his precious altitude minimums. She followed orders, and the intelligence target escaped. 3 weeks later, that same target was responsible for an IED attack that killed 4 Marines." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. "And Hughes?" "Transferred out within a month." Brennan made sure her personnel file included references to questionable judgment and failure to adapt to command expectations. She's flying supply runs in Alaska now. "So he's done this before." Jennifer nodded grimly. "Brennan has a pattern. He targets the best pilots, the ones who might outshine him or challenge his authority. Then he puts them in impossible situations where they have to choose between their principles and their careers. Most choose their careers, and the ones who don't find themselves on the fast track to nowhere." Jennifer leaned forward, lowering her voice. "But here's what Brennan doesn't know. Some of us have been keeping track of his pattern, documenting the incidents, the transfers, the convenient timing of his command decisions." Rachel looked up sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you're not alone in this fight. There are people here who see what Brennan is doing, who understand that his ego is putting lives at risk." Jennifer pulled a small flash drive from her pocket and placed it on the table. "That contains incident reports, witness statements, and mission analyses from the past 18 months. Everything we've been able to gather about Brennan's command decisions and their consequences." Rachel stared at the drive as if it were a venomous snake. Taking it would be crossing the line, committing herself to a course of action that could destroy her career even more thoroughly than Brennan's games. But leaving it on the table meant accepting that good pilots would continue to be destroyed and good people would continue to die because of one man's arrogance. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Because you're good enough to beat him," Jennifer replied. "And because you're new enough that he hasn't completely destroyed your credibility yet. The pilots who have been here longer, they've all been compromised in one way or another. They've all made choices they regret, followed orders they knew were wrong. But you still have clean hands. Not after today, I don't. Today was a test," Jennifer said firmly. "Brennan wanted to see if you could be broken. Now he thinks you can be controlled. That gives you an advantage he doesn't know you have." Rachel picked up the flash drive, feeling its weight like a stone in her palm. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Build a case. Document everything. And when the time comes, be ready to act." Jennifer finished her beer and stood to leave. "But be careful. Brennan has allies in high places, and he won't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatens him." As Jennifer walked away, Rachel pocketed the flash drive and finally drained her whiskey. The alcohol burned, but not as much as the shame she'd been carrying since the afternoon. For the first time since arriving at Ridgepoint, she felt like she had a purpose beyond simply surviving Brennan's persecution. The next morning brought a new humiliation. Rachel arrived at the flight line to find Iron Storm grounded for what Brennan called routine maintenance inspection. The aircraft was in perfect condition, Regulations allowed commanders to ground aircraft for any reason they deemed necessary. How long? Rachel asked the crew chief, Technical Sergeant Mike. Torres looked uncomfortable. Colonel's orders are indefinite pending complete systems check. Could be days, could be weeks. Rachel felt her hands clenching into fists. Grounding her aircraft was Brennan's way of punishing her for the previous day's radio exchange, but it was also removing her from potential mission rotations. While other pilots flew combat sorties, she would be stuck on the ground. Sergeant Torres, she said carefully, in your professional opinion, is there anything wrong with this aircraft? Torres glanced around nervously before answering. Ma'am, I've been maintaining birds for 15 years. Iron Storm is one of the cleanest, most reliable aircraft in the squadron. There's nothing wrong with her that would justify grounding. I appreciate your honesty, Sergeant. Ma'am? Torres stepped closer, lowering his voice. The colonel has been asking questions about your maintenance records, your flight hours, even your personal conduct reports. It's like he's building a file. On you. Rachel's blood ran cold. If Brennan was building a personnel case against her, it meant he was preparing for something bigger than simple harassment. He was laying the groundwork for formal disciplinary action or forced transfer. What kind of questions? Everything. How often you pre-flight, how you treat the crew, whether you follow technical orders to the letter. He even asked if you'd ever requested modifications to standard equipment or procedures. Rachel's mind raced. Every pilot requested minor modifications based on personal preference or mission requirements. It was standard practice, but in the wrong hands, such requests could be portrayed as insubordination or disregard for regulations. Sergeant, I need you to do me a favor. Ma'am? I want you to document every conversation you have with Colonel Brennan about me or my aircraft. Dates, times, exact words if possible. Can you do that? Torres nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. But if the colonel finds out ... He won't? And Sergeant? You're not the only one he's questioning. Talk to the other crew chiefs, quietly. See if he's building files on other pilots, too. As Rachel walked away from the flight line, she felt the walls closing in around her. Brennan wasn't just targeting her for harassment. He was preparing to destroy her career systematically and thoroughly. But Jennifer Walsh was right about one thing. Rachel still had advantages that Brennan didn't know about. That evening, she plugged the flash drive into her personal laptop and began reading. What she found was worse than she'd imagined. Brennan's pattern of targeting skilled pilots went back almost 2 years, and the consequences had been devastating. Missions failed, lives lost, careers destroyed, all to feed one man's need for absolute control. But patterns could be broken, and Rachel was beginning to see how the key was in the regulations Brennan used to justify his actions. He relied on his position and political connections to shield him from consequences. But military law was still military law. If she could prove that his command decisions were not just wrong but criminally negligent, even his political allies wouldn't be able to protect him. Rachel pulled out a fresh notebook and began making plans. She would need evidence, witnesses, and perfect timing. Most importantly, she would need to survive long enough to use what she gathered. Outside her window, Iron Storm sat silent and empty on the flight line, grounded by the petty vindictiveness of a man who valued his own authority over the lives of the people he was supposed to protect. But aircraft didn't stay grounded forever, and when Iron Storm took to the sky again, Rachel intended to be ready for the fight of her life. Colonel Brennan had made a critical mistake. He had underestimated the pilot he was trying to break. Rachel Coleman had survived 12 years in military aviation by being smarter, tougher, and more determined than anyone expected. Now she was about to show Brennan exactly what that meant. The call came at 0300 hours on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Rachel was pulled from deep sleep by the harsh buzz of her secure phone, the one reserved for emergency notifications. Her training kicked in immediately, and she was fully alert before the second ring. Major Coleman, this is operations. We have a situation developing in grid sector Alpha 7. All available pilots report immediately. Rachel was dressed and moving within minutes, her mind automatically running through pre-flight checklists. Even as she jogged through the pre-dawn darkness toward the operations building, the base was coming alive around her, vehicles moving with purpose, personnel running toward their duty stations. This wasn't a drill. The briefing room was chaos. When she arrived, intelligence officers huddled over satellite feeds. Communication specialists worked multiple radio channels simultaneously, and pilots gathered around a large tactical display showing a region of mountainous terrain marked with red symbols, indicating hostile activity. Major Walsh stepped to the front of the room, his face grim. "Gentlemen, ladies, we have a developing crisis. A 12-man reconnaissance team, call sign Alpha 7, has been pinned down in a canyon complex designated Hades Gate. Enemy forces have them surrounded, and weather conditions are preventing conventional rescue operations." Rachel studied the terrain display with growing concern. Hades Gate was notorious among military aviators as a no-fly zone, a narrow canyon system with walls so steep and winds so unpredictable that several aircraft have been lost there over the years. The canyon earned its nickname because pilots said it was where good intentions went to die. Current weather shows crosswinds gusting to 60 knots, limited visibility due to blowing sand, and cloud cover at 400 feet, Walsh continued. Navy SEALs have assessed the situation and recommend waiting for weather improvement before attempting extraction. Rachel's hand shot up. "Sir, what's the timeline on Alpha 7? How long can they hold their position?" "Intelligence estimates. They have ammunition for perhaps 6 hours of sustained contact. After that, ... Walsh's voice trailed off, but everyone in the room understood the implications. Colonel Brennan stepped forward, and Rachel felt her stomach tighten. "This is exactly the kind of situation where heroic thinking gets people killed," he announced. "We will wait for weather conditions to improve before attempting any rescue operation. I will not risk additional lives on a low-probability mission." "Sir," Rachel stood up, knowing she was about to cross a line but unable to stop herself. 6 hours may be too long. If we wait for perfect weather, Alpha 7 could be overrun before we get there." Brennan's eyes locked onto hers with the intensity of a targeting laser. "Major Coleman, are you volunteering for a suicide mission?" "I'm volunteering for a rescue mission, sir. I've studied the terrain around Hades Gate extensively. There are approach routes that could work even in current weather conditions." "Approach routes?" Brennan's voice carried a note of incredulous anger. "Major, that canyon has claimed 4 aircraft in the past 5 years. Professional pilots with years of experience flying in that region. What makes you think you can succeed where they failed?" Rachel felt every eye in the room focusing on her, but she pressed forward. "Because I'm not planning to fight the terrain, sir. I'm planning to use it. The same wind patterns that make the canyon dangerous can also provide cover and concealment from ground-based threats. Absolutely not." Brennan's voice cut through the room like a blade. "I will not authorize a single aircraft mission into Hades Gate under current conditions. The risk to pilot and aircraft is unacceptable. Sir, with respect, 12 lives are at stake. The risk calculation includes the fact that losing another aircraft won't help Alpha 7 and will only add to the casualty count." Brennan interrupted. "This discussion is over. We wait for weather improvement." Rachel felt something break loose inside her chest, a dam of frustration and anger that had been building for weeks. "Colonel, those men are counting on us. They're pinned down in hostile territory with limited ammunition and no way out. If we wait, we're condemning them to death or capture." Brennan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Major Coleman, you are relieved of duty pending disciplinary review. Report to your quarters immediately." The room fell silent. Rachel could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel the shocked stares of her fellow pilots. Being relieved of duty during an active emergency was career suicide, but she found that she no longer cared about her career. "Sir, I request permission to speak with someone higher in the chain of command about this tactical decision." Request denied. "You are confined to quarters. Security will escort you if necessary." Rachel looked around the room one last time, seeing the mixture of sympathy and fear in her colleagues' faces. Tom Rodriguez looked like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Jennifer Walsh sat near the back, her expression unreadable. "Understood, sir," Rachel said finally. "But I wanted on the record that Alpha 7 could be saved. If we act now instead of hiding behind regulations." Brennan's face darkened. "Your opinion is noted, Major. Now remove yourself from this briefing." Rachel walked out of the operations building with her head high, but inside she was screaming. 12 good men were going to die because Colonel Brennan valued his own authority more than their lives. She had tried to work within the system, tried to follow proper channels and military courtesy, but the system was broken as she reached her quarters. Rachel's secure phone buzzed again. A text message from an unknown number. "Iron Storm maintenance complete. Aircraft ready for immediate service. Torres." Rachel stared at the message, her mind racing. Iron Storm was no longer grounded, which meant she had options. Dangerous options that would end her military career and probably result in court-martial. But options nonetheless. She looked back toward the operations building where Brennan was, undoubtedly congratulating himself on maintaining proper command discipline. Then she looked toward the flight line, where Iron Storm waited in the pre-dawn darkness. The choice was simple: follow orders and let Alpha 7 die, or break every regulation in the book and give them a fighting chance. Rachel Coleman had spent 12 years following orders, trusting the system, believing that doing the right thing and the legal thing were the same thing. But sometimes the system failed, and when it did, individual conscience had to fill the gap. She changed into her flight suit with deliberate precision, checking and rechecking every piece of equipment. If she was going to do this, she would do it right. Iron Storm deserved a pilot who was prepared for the challenge ahead. As she walked toward the flight line, Rachel felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. For the first time since arriving at Ridgepoint, she knew exactly what she needed to do. Colonel Brennan could destroy her career, but he couldn't stop her from saving Alpha 7. The breaking point had been reached, and Rachel Coleman was about to discover just how far she was willing to go when everything else fell away except the mission and the lives depending on her. Iron Storm waited in the darkness, ready to carry her into the storm that was Hades' Gate. And for the first time in weeks, Rachel was ready to fly like her life depended on it, because this time, it wasn't her life hanging in the balance. It was theirs. Rachel moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the careful precision of someone who understood that every step from this point forward would be scrutinized, analyzed, and potentially used against her in a court-martial. But she also moved with the quiet confidence of a pilot who had finally found clarity in the chaos of military politics and personal conscience. Iron Storm sat on the flight line, exactly where Sergeant Torres had promised, fueled and ready. The aircraft's familiar silhouette looked different in the faint starlight, no longer grounded and impotent, but poised for action. Rachel approached her bird with the reverence of a gunfighter checking her weapons before the final showdown. "Ma'am?" Rachel turned to find Sergeant Torres emerging from the shadows near the aircraft. His face was tense, worried, but determined. I heard what happened in the briefing. Word travels fast around here. Sergeant, you need to distance yourself from this. What I'm about to do is going to have consequences, and I won't let them fall. On you. Torres shook his head firmly. With respect, ma'am, I've been watching Colonel Brennan destroy good pilots for 2 years. Kelly Hughes was the best pilot I ever worked with, and he drove her out because she threatened his little kingdom. I'm not standing by and watching him do it again. This isn't just about standing up to Brennan anymore, Rachel said quietly. I'm about to violate direct orders and launch an unauthorized mission into hostile territory. That's court-martial territory, Sergeant. Yes, ma'am. But 12 men are going to die if somebody doesn't help them, and you're the only pilot on this base with the skills to pull it off. Torres handed her a tablet containing Iron Storm's maintenance records. As far as my logs show, you're conducting a routine test flight to verify systems after maintenance. I have no knowledge of your actual destination or mission parameters. Rachel looked at the tablet, then at Torres. The sergeant was offering her exactly what she needed: plausible deniability for her ground, crew and official documentation that would make it harder for Brennan to charge her with theft of military property. Sergeant, there's something else. I need you to make sure someone else knows what really happened here. If this goes bad, if I don't make it back, I need the truth to survive. Torres nodded toward the operations building. Captain Walsh is waiting in the intelligence section. She said to tell you that some fights are worth having, even when you can't win them. Rachel felt a surge of gratitude for Jennifer Walsh's support, but also a chill of fear. If Jennifer was involved, it meant the stakes were even higher than she'd realized. Tell Captain Walsh that I understand, Rachel said. And Sergeant, thank you. Bring them home, ma'am. Rachel completed her pre-flight inspection with mechanical precision, checking every system, every connection, every component that would keep Iron Storm flying through the hell she was about to enter. The A-10 Warthog wasn't pretty, but it was built for punishment, designed to absorb damage and keep flying when sleeker aircraft would fall from the sky dot as she climbed into the cockpit. Rachel's hands moved through the startup sequence with the automatic certainty of thousands of hours of training. Engines spooled up with their familiar whine. Instruments came alive with green lights, and slowly Iron Storm transformed from a sleeping machine into a weapon of war. Tower, this is Storm 17 requesting clearance for routine test flight. She radioed, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. The response came from a controller she didn't recognize. Someone working the night shift who had no knowledge of the drama unfolding in the operations building. Storm 17. Cleared for departure runway 27. Winds light and variable, ceiling 400 feet. Roger. Tower. Storm 17 departing. Iron Storm rolled forward into the darkness, gathering speed until the familiar sensation of lift carried them into the night sky. Rachel climbed, just high enough to clear the base perimeter, then leveled off and turned toward the mountains where Alpha 7 was fighting for their lives. The weather was every bit as bad as the briefing had indicated. Crosswinds buffeted the aircraft, forcing constant corrections, and visibility dropped to almost nothing as she entered the first line of hills. But Rachel had flown in worse conditions, and more importantly, she had studied the terrain around Hades Gate with the obsessive attention to detail that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. Her first stop wasn't the canyon itself, but a listening post on a nearby ridgeline, where she could tap into the tactical communications network without revealing her position. She needed real-time intelligence on Alpha 7's situation before committing to the dangerous approach into Hades Gate. The radio chatter she intercepted painted a grim picture. Alpha 7 was pinned down in a narrow section of the canyon with enemy forces on 3 sides. Their ammunition was running low. 2 men were wounded, and the team leader's voice carried the strain of someone who was running out of options. Any station. This is Alpha 7 Actual. We are combat ineffective in 1 hour. Request immediate extraction or close air support. The response came from Ridgepoint Base, and Rachel recognized the voice of Major Walsh. Alpha 7. Be advised weather conditions prevent immediate extraction. Stand by for further instructions. Ridgepoint, Alpha 7. Negative on standing by. We need help now, or we're not going to be here when the weather clears. Rachel keyed her microphone, knowing that her transmission would expose her location and her unauthorized presence in the area. Alpha 7, this is Storm 17. I'm inbound to your position for close air support. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then Alpha 7's team leader came back on the radio, his voice filled with desperate hope. Storm 17, Alpha 7. Are you authorized for this mission? Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, thinking about all the ways she could answer that question. Technically, she was authorized to fly Iron Storm. The aircraft was assigned to her, and she was qualified for the mission. The fact that she was violating direct orders and disobeying her commanding officer was a detail that could be sorted out later. Alpha 7, Storm 17 is en route. Transmit your exact position and enemy disposition, as Alpha 7 provided. Targeting information, Rachel began her descent toward Hades Gate. The canyon loomed ahead like a wound in the earth, its walls disappearing into the low clouds that shrouded the peaks. This was the point of no return, the moment when she would either prove that her confidence was justified or become another cautionary tale about pilots who flew beyond their abilities. But as Iron Storm knifed through the turbulent air toward the canyon entrance, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. The pure, undiluted joy of flying a mission that mattered. Whatever consequences awaited her back at Ridgepoint, whatever career-ending disciplinary action Brennan had in store, none of it mattered compared to the 12 men counting on her to bring them home. The radio crackled with an incoming transmission from Ridgepoint Base, and Rachel recognized Brennan's voice, tight with fury. Storm 17, you are ordered to abort immediately and return to base. Acknowledge. Rachel looked ahead toward Hades Gate, where the canyon walls seemed to close like jaws, waiting to snap shut. Behind her lay the safety of following orders, and the certainty of watching good men die. Ahead lay the unknown, the possibility of failure, and the slim chance of proving that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing were two different choices. Storm 17 copies, she transmitted, going radio silent for approach. She switched off her communication system, cutting the last link between herself and the authority that would stop her from doing what needed to be done. From this point forward, she was on her own, flying on skill, instinct, and the desperate hope that she was good enough to succeed where others had failed. Iron Storm entered Hades Gate at 200 feet above the canyon floor, immediately swallowed by walls of stone that seemed to press in from all sides. The wind became a living thing, grabbing at the aircraft with invisible hands, trying to dash it against the rocks. But Rachel had trained for this, studied the patterns, learned to read the mountain's moods. Ahead, the canyon bent sharply to the right, disappearing into shadows that could hide anything. Somewhere beyond that bend, Alpha 7 was making their last stand. And for the first time since arriving at Ridgepoint Air Base, Rachel Coleman was exactly where she belonged, flying into danger to save lives, regardless of what anyone else thought about proper procedures or acceptable risk. The fight back had begun, and it was going to be decided in the narrow space between the canyon walls, where skill mattered more than rank and courage counted for more than politics. The first burst of enemy fire came from Rachel's left, muzzle flashes sparkling like deadly stars against the dark canyon wall. Tracer rounds streaked past Iron Storm's canopy, close enough that she could see their red trails reflected in her instruments. The enemy had spotted her approach and was trying to bring her down before she could reach Alpha 7's position. Rachel banked hard right, using the canyon's natural curve to break the shooter's line of sight. The A-10's heavy airframe groaned under the stress of the tight maneuver, but held together as she dove even lower, skimming the canyon floor at a height that would have terrified most pilots. But fear was a luxury she couldn't afford with 12 men counting on her. Alpha 7, Storm 17. I have visual on enemy positions. Marking targets now. The response came immediately, filled with relief and desperation. Storm 17, Alpha 7. We have multiple positions on the north wall, approximately 200 meters from our location. They have us pinned down and are preparing to advance. Rachel could see them now, muzzle flashes from concealed positions. Among the rocks, the telltale heat signatures of enemy fighters moving to flank Alpha 7's defensive position. The reconnaissance team was trapped in a small depression near a bend in the canyon, using whatever cover they could find while enemy forces closed in from 3 directions. But Rachel also saw something else, a tactical opportunity that could turn the tide of the battle. The enemy fighters were positioned on narrow ledges and rocky outcrops that offered good fields of fire but limited escape routes. If she could attack from an unexpected angle, she could trap them in their own positions. Iron. Storm's Go-8 Avenger cannon was designed for exactly this kind of work. 7 barrels rotating at high speed, firing 30mm rounds at a rate that could chew through armor, concrete, or human flesh with equal efficiency. Rachel had trained with the weapon for years, but this would be her first time using it in combat. She lined up her first attack run, diving toward the enemy positions at an angle that kept the canyon walls between her and the heaviest concentrations of ground fire. The Warthog responded to her commands like an extension of her own body, banking and climbing through the turbulent air with surprising grace for such a heavy aircraft. The targeting reticle centered on a cluster of enemy fighters positioned behind a rocky barricade. Rachel squeezed the trigger, and the Avenger cannon roared to life with a sound like thunder being torn apart. The rounds impacted among the rocks in a series of devastating explosions, sending stone fragments and debris cascading down the canyon wall. When the dust cleared, the enemy position was gone, reduced to rubble and silence. Direct hit. Alpha 7's team leader shouted over the radio, "Storm 17, you just saved our lives." But Rachel wasn't finished. She pulled Iron Storm into a climbing turn, scanning for the next threat while staying low enough to avoid the worst of the crosswinds. More enemy positions revealed themselves as fighters opened fire, trying to bring down the aircraft that was systematically destroying their advantage. Meanwhile, back at Ridgepoint Air Base, Colonel Brennan was discovering that his authority had limits. The unauthorized mission was unfolding in real time on the tactical displays in the operations center, and word was spreading through the base like wildfire. Everyone knew that Storm 17 was in Hades Gate, and everyone knew that Brennan had ordered the pilot to stand down. "Sir," Major Walsh approached Brennan with obvious reluctance. "We're receiving reports that Storm 17 has engaged enemy forces in the target area. Alpha 7 is requesting immediate extraction support." Brennan's face was livid with rage. "I don't care what reports we're receiving. Major Coleman is flying an unauthorized mission in violation of direct orders. When she returns, she'll be placed under arrest pending court-martial." "Colonel," Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice carefully respectful but firm. "Sir, if Major Coleman succeeds in extracting Alpha 7, it's going to be very difficult to court-martial her for saving 12 lives. She's risking her life and a valuable aircraft on a suicide mission," Brennan snapped. "When she crashes in that canyon, her death will be on her own head." But even as Brennan spoke, It was becoming clear that Rachel wasn't going to crash. The tactical display showed Iron Storm moving through Hades Gate with precision and purpose, engaging enemy positions with devastating effectiveness. What had seemed impossible 20 minutes earlier was actually happening. A single pilot was taking on an entrenched enemy force in the worst flying conditions imaginable and winning. Captain Jennifer Walsh entered the operations center, carrying a thick folder of documents. Her face was grim but determined as she approached Brennan's position near the tactical display. "Colonel, I need to speak with you privately about Major Coleman's mission." Brennan barely glanced at her. "Captain Walsh, I'm busy managing a crisis caused by an insubordinate pilot. Whatever you have to say can wait." "No, sir, it can't." Jennifer's voice carried an edge that made several nearby officers look up. "I have evidence that your command decisions over the past 18 months have resulted in mission failures, lost intelligence opportunities, and unnecessary casualties. Major Coleman's current actions are consistent with a pattern of pilots being forced to choose between following your orders and accomplishing their missions." The operations center fell silent. Jennifer had just accused a full colonel of criminal negligence in front of 24 witnesses, an action that could end her career even faster than Rachel's unauthorized flight. Brennan turned slowly, his face pale with shock and rage. "Captain Walsh, you are relieved of duty immediately. Security will escort you to confinement." "I don't think so, sir." Jennifer held up the folder. "This contains documented evidence of your systematic destruction of competent pilots who threatened your authority. Kelly Hughes, David Anderson, Maria Santos, and 6 others who were transferred or disciplined after questioning your tactical decisions. Major Coleman is just the latest in a long line of officers you've targeted for elimination. You're making wild accusations based on coincidence and speculation," Brennan said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I won't dignify this insubordination with a response." "Then maybe you'll dignify a response from the Inspector General's office," Jennifer replied calmly, "because copies of this evidence have already been forwarded to higher headquarters. Your protection from political allies won't help when the facts are laid out in an official investigation." Brennan's face went from pale to gray. An Inspector General investigation would examine every decision he'd made, every pilot he'd transferred, every mission he'd compromised. Even with political connections, he couldn't survive the kind of scrutiny that Jennifer was threatening. "You're bluffing," he said weakly. "Am I?" Jennifer smiled coldly. "Would you like to bet your career on that assessment?" In Hades Gate, Rachel was finishing her systematic destruction of the enemy force that had trapped Alpha 7. 3 attack runs had eliminated the heavy weapons positions, scattered the infantry, and cleared a path for extraction helicopters to reach the canyon floor. The reconnaissance team was already moving toward the designated pickup zone, their wounded supported by their teammates. Storm 17, Alpha 7, all positions neutralized. "We are moving to extraction point now." "How copy?" Rachel keyed her microphone, feeling a surge of satisfaction that made all the career consequences seem worthwhile. "Alpha 7, Storm 17 copies. Extraction birds are inbound your position. Keep your heads down until they arrive." As she pulled Iron Storm into a protective orbit over the extraction site, Rachel's radio crackled with an incoming transmission from Ridgepoint base, but this time it wasn't Brennan's voice. "Storm 17, this is General Morrison, Tactical Air Command. Please respond." Rachel's blood ran cold. General Morrison was 3 levels above Brennan in the chain of command, an officer whose attention she definitely didn't want to attract under current circumstances. "General Morrison, Storm 17. Go ahead, sir." "Major Coleman, I'm watching your mission from here at headquarters. Outstanding work. Alpha 7 will be extracted safely because of your actions today." Rachel blinked in surprise. She had expected rage, threats of court-martial, immediate orders to return to base. Instead, she was receiving praise from one of the most senior officers in the Air Force. "Thank you, sir. Just doing my job." "Yes, you are. And doing it exceptionally well under very difficult circumstances." There was a pause. Then Morrison's voice continued with a different tone. "Major, I understand there may be some command issues at Ridgepoint that need to be addressed. When you return from this mission, I'd like to speak with you personally about your experiences there." Rachel looked down at Alpha 7's extraction in progress, then back toward Ridgepoint, where Brennan was undoubtedly watching his carefully constructed kingdom crumble around him. The downfall had begun, and it was accelerating faster than anyone could have predicted. "I'll be available at your convenience, General." "Excellent. And Major? When this is over, I think we need to talk about your next assignment. The Air Force needs pilots who understand that sometimes the mission comes first, regardless of what the regulations say." As the extraction helicopters lifted off with Alpha 7 safely aboard, Rachel turned Iron Storm toward home. But she was returning to a very different Ridgepoint Air Base than the one she'd left in the darkness hours earlier. The balance of power had shifted, and Colonel Brennan was about to discover that some fights couldn't be won through intimidation and political connections. The storm was far from over, but for the first time since arriving at Ridgepoint, Rachel felt like she was flying with the wind at her back instead of fighting against it. The debriefing room at Ridgepoint Air Base had never seen anything quite like the gathering that assembled 3 hours after Rachel's return from Hades. Gate. General Morrison had flown in personally from Tactical Air Command headquarters, bringing with him a team of investigators, legal officers, and senior staff members whose presence transformed a routine post-mission analysis into something approaching a tribunal. Rachel sat at one end of the long conference table, still wearing her flight suit, the fabric marked with sweat stains and the faint smell of jet fuel that always lingered after combat missions. Across from her, Colonel Brennan occupied his usual position of authority, but his posture had changed. The confident arrogance that had defined his command style was gone, replaced by the rigid tension of a man who knew his world was collapsing. General Morrison presided from the head of the table, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he reviewed the mission reports spread before him. To his right sat Colonel Patricia Hayes, the Inspector General's representative, whose presence meant that this was no longer just about Rachel's unauthorized flight. The investigation had expanded far beyond a single incident of insubordination. "Major Coleman," General Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of command experience, "let's start with your decision to launch this mission, despite explicit orders to stand down. Walk me through your reasoning." Rachel had spent the past 3 hours preparing for this moment, knowing that her next words would determine not just her own future, but the fate of every pilot who had suffered under Brennan's command. She chose her words carefully, speaking with the precision of someone who understood that honesty was her only viable defense. "Sir, I was faced with a choice between following orders and preventing the capture or death of 12 American servicemen. The weather conditions that Colonel Brennan cited as prohibitive were challenging, but flyable for a properly trained pilot using appropriate tactics. I assessed that the risk to Alpha 7 outweighed the risk to my aircraft and myself." "Colonel Brennan," Morrison turned to face the squadron commander, "your assessment was that the mission was impossible under current conditions. Yet Major Coleman succeeded. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Brennan's response came too quickly, with the defensive edge of someone who had been caught off guard. "General, Major Coleman got lucky. The fact that she didn't crash doesn't validate her reckless disregard for proper command authority. She violated direct orders and risked a valuable aircraft on what amounted to a suicide mission. A suicide mission that saved 12 lives, interjected Captain Jennifer Walsh from her position near the back of the room. And according to the evidence I've provided to the Inspector General's office, this isn't the first time Colonel Brennan has prioritized aircraft preservation over mission accomplishment. Brennan's face flushed red. Captain Walsh has a personal agenda against me. Her accusations are based on speculation and— Colonel Hayes interrupted, opening a thick folder of documents. Captain Walsh's evidence includes incident reports, witness statements, and communications transcripts covering 18 months of questionable command decisions. Would you like to address the pattern that emerges from this documentation? The room fell silent as Hayes began reading from the file. Mission after mission, where Brennan had ordered pilots to abort dangerous but necessary operations. Tactical. Opportunities lost because he refused to authorize anything that carried significant risk. Good pilots transferred out after challenging his decisions. In the case of Major Kelly Hughes, Hayes continued, you ordered her to abort a time-sensitive intelligence-gathering mission because it required flying below your preferred altitude minimums. 3 weeks later, the target she was ordered not to pursue was responsible for an IED attack that killed 4 Marines. Do you recall this incident? Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Every command decision involves calculated risks. I prioritized the safety of my pilots and aircraft over uncertain intelligence value. Uncertain intelligence value? Rachel couldn't keep the incredulity out of her voice. Sir, that target was a known bomb maker responsible for multiple attacks on coalition forces. Kelly Hughes had him dead to rights, and you ordered her to let him escape because you were afraid she might scratch the paint on her aircraft. Major Coleman, Brennan snapped, you will speak when spoken to. This is exactly the kind of insubordinate attitude that what, Colonel? General Morrison's voice cut through the exchange like a blade. That led her to save Alpha 7 when your leadership would have left them to die. Colonel, I've been reviewing your command record for the past 2 years, and what I see is a pattern of risk aversion that borders on cowardice. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. In military circles, cowardice was the ultimate indictment. Worse than incompetence, worse than failure. It was the one charge that could destroy a career instantly and permanently. Brennan's face went white. General, I resent the implication. My command philosophy prioritizes the welfare of my personnel and the preservation of valuable assets. Your command philosophy, Morrison replied coldly, has resulted in mission failures, intelligence losses, and the systematic elimination of your most competent pilots. Major Coleman succeeded today because she possesses exactly the kind of tactical judgment and moral courage that effective combat pilots require, qualities that you've been actively punishing in your squadron. Colonel Hayes leaned forward, her voice carrying the formal tone of official proceedings. Colonel Brennan, based on the evidence gathered by this investigation, formal charges are being prepared alleging dereliction of duty, conduct unbecoming an officer, and failure to accomplish assigned missions. You are hereby relieved of command, pending the outcome of a court-martial proceeding. The words struck Brennan like physical blows. He sat frozen in his chair, staring at Hayes as if she had spoken in a foreign language. The absolute authority he had wielded for 2 years was gone, evaporated in the space of a single sentence. General, he said weakly, I protest these charges in the strongest possible terms. My record speaks for itself. Yes, it does, Morrison. Agreed. And what it says is that you've been more concerned with protecting your own career than accomplishing the mission. Major Coleman demonstrated today what real leadership looks like, making the hard choice when lives are on the line, regardless of personal consequences. Rachel felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness as she watched Brennan's downfall unfold. She had wanted justice, but seeing a fellow officer destroyed was never entirely satisfying, even when that officer had earned his fate through his own actions. "Major Coleman," Morrison turned back to her, "your actions today were technically insubordinate, but they were also necessary and successful. The Air Force needs officers who understand that sometimes the rulebook takes second place to saving lives. However, we can't have pilots launching unauthorized missions every time they disagree with their commanders." Rachel nodded, understanding that some form of disciplinary action was still possible despite the successful outcome of her mission. "I understand, sir. I accept full responsibility for my actions." "Good, which is why your punishment will be a transfer to the Advanced Tactical Training Command, where you'll help develop new low-altitude combat doctrines and train the next generation of close air support pilots. Consider it a lateral promotion with significantly more responsibility." Rachel blinked in surprise. She had expected court-martial, disgrace, or at best a letter of reprimand in her personnel file. Instead, she was being offered exactly the kind of assignment that would advance her career and allow her to make a real difference in military aviation. "Sir, I'm honored by your confidence." "Don't thank me yet," Morrison said with a slight smile. "The job comes with the expectation that you'll continue to make the hard choices when necessary. Can you handle that level of responsibility?" Rachel looked around the room at the faces watching her response. Captain Walsh smiled encouragingly. Tom Rodriguez gave her a subtle thumbs up. Even some of Brennan's former allies seemed relieved that the toxic command environment was finally coming to an end. "Yes, sir, I can handle it." As the formal proceedings concluded and people began filing out of the room, Rachel remained seated for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. In the span of a few hours, she had gone from facing potential court-martial to receiving a career-enhancing assignment. Brennan's reign of intimidation was over, and the pilots he had terrorized would finally be free to do their jobs without fear of political retaliation. But more importantly, 12 men from Alpha 7 were alive because someone had been willing to risk everything to save them. That fact alone made every consequence, every moment of uncertainty, every sleepless night worth it. Colonel Brennan sat alone at the conference table, staring at the papers that documented the end of his military career. The absolute power he had wielded so ruthlessly had been stripped away, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his own choices. Rachel stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Colonel," she said quietly, "for what it's worth, this didn't have to happen. If you had just trusted your pilots to do their jobs, none of us would be here today." Brennan looked up at her with eyes that held no recognition, no understanding of how his own actions had led to this moment. He was still convinced that he had been the victim of insubordinate subordinates and political machinations beyond his control. "This isn't over, Coleman," he said with what little authority he had left. "I have allies, connections. You haven't won anything." Rachel shook her head sadly. "Colonel, I never wanted to win anything. I just wanted to save lives and do my job. You're the one who made it a war." As she walked out of the debriefing room and into the afternoon sunlight, Rachel felt the weight of the past months lifting from her shoulders. Iron Storm waited on the flight line, ready for whatever mission came next. And for the first time since arriving at Ridgepoint Air Base, Rachel knew that she would be flying those missions with the full support of commanders who valued courage over compliance, results over politics. The storm had passed, and the sky was clear for flying. 6 months after the events at Hades Gate, Rachel Coleman stood on the flight line at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, watching a formation of A-10 Warthogs practice the low-altitude tactics that had become her signature training program. The aircraft moved through the desert air with precision and confidence, Their pilots executing maneuvers that would have been considered impossible under the old doctrine that prioritized safety over effectiveness. The advanced tactical training. Command had given Rachel everything she had hoped for. The authority to develop new combat techniques, the resources to train exceptional pilots, and the freedom to push the boundaries of what was possible in close air support operations. More importantly, it had given her the chance to ensure that future generations of pilots would be prepared for the kind of impossible missions that sometimes define the difference between victory and defeat. Major Coleman? The voice belonged to Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, one of Rachel's most promising students. Martinez had the rare combination of technical skill and tactical instinct that marked truly exceptional pilots. But she also had the confidence that came from training under someone who had proven that conventional wisdom wasn't always correct. What is it, Martinez? Ma'am, we just received word that Alpha 7 has been deployed to a classified operation in the Middle East. Team leader specifically requested close air support from advanced tactical training graduates. Apparently, they trust our low altitude capabilities more than conventional pilots. Rachel smiled at the news. Alpha 7 had recovered from their ordeal in Hades Gate and returned to operational status within 2 months. The team leader, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, had written her a personal letter expressing gratitude for the rescue mission. But more importantly, he had become an advocate for the kind of aggressive air support tactics that Rachel was developing. That's good news, Martinez. It means the training is working and word is spreading through the special operations community. When operators start specifically requesting our graduates, we know we're making a difference. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a staff car carrying General Morrison and Colonel Patricia Hayes, both of whom had become regular visitors to Rachel's training program. Their presence usually meant important news, either about the program's expansion or about the ongoing legal proceedings surrounding Colonel Brennan's court-martial. Major Coleman, General Morrison approached with his characteristic direct manner. I have an update on the Brennan situation that I thought you'd want to hear personally. Rachel had been following the court-martial proceedings from a distance, providing testimony when required, but trying to focus on her new responsibilities rather than dwelling on the past. Brennan's trial had become something of a landmark case. In military justice circles, establishing precedents about command responsibility and the limits of authority. What's the verdict, sir? Guilty on all counts, Morrison said without preamble. Dereliction of duty, conduct unbecoming, failure to accomplish assigned missions. He's been sentenced to dismissal from the service with loss of all benefits. The court found that his pattern of command decisions constituted a systematic failure to uphold his oath of office. Rachel felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness at the news. Justice had been served, but the destruction of any military career, even one as toxic as Brennan's, was never entirely pleasant to witness. What about the other cases? The pilots he transferred or drove out of the service? Colonel Hayes answered that question. The Inspector General's investigation has resulted in a comprehensive review of personnel actions taken under Brennan's command. Major Kelly Hughes has been offered reinstatement with full promotion eligibility. The other affected officers are being given similar opportunities to restore their careers. And the policy changes? Significant, Morrison replied. Your mission to Hades Gate has become required study material at the War College. We're implementing new doctrines that give operational commanders more flexibility to authorize high-risk missions when the tactical situation warrants it. Essentially, we're codifying the principle that mission accomplishment sometimes requires accepting significant risk. Rachel nodded, understanding that her unauthorized flight had created ripple effects far beyond the immediate rescue of Alpha 7. The military was a conservative institution that changed slowly, but when change came, it was usually in response to dramatic events that forced a re-evaluation of existing assumptions. There's something else, Morrison continued. The Secretary of Defense has approved a new unit designation, the Special Operations Air Support Squadron. It will be based here at Nellis, with you as the commanding officer. Your mission will be to provide specialized close air support for the most challenging special operations missions. Rachel felt her breath catch in her throat. Command of her own squadron was a career milestone she had hoped to achieve eventually, but the opportunity was coming years earlier than she had expected. More importantly, it was exactly the kind of assignment that would allow her to implement her tactical innovations on a broader scale. Sir, I'm honored by the confidence. When do I assume command? Next month. Your first operational deployment will be classified, but I can tell you that it involves providing air support for operations in terrain that conventional doctrine considers no-fly zones. Essentially, you'll be doing officially what you did unofficially 6 months ago. As the two senior officers departed, Rachel remained on the flight line, watching her students continue their training. The afternoon sun painted the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson, reminding her of the sunrise she had watched from Iron Storm's cockpit as she flew home from Hades Gate. Lieutenant Martinez approached again, this time with obvious excitement. Ma'am, word is already spreading about the new squadron assignment. Every pilot in the training program is volunteering for transfer. They want to serve under your command. Why? Martinez looked surprised by the question. Because you've shown us what's possible when you're willing to risk everything for the mission. You've proven that there's no such thing as impossible terrain or impossible odds if you have the skills and the courage to push through. Rachel thought about that assessment as she walked toward the squadron building where her next class was. Waiting. 6 months ago, she had been a major facing potential court-martial for disobeying orders. Today, she was preparing to command a specialized unit that would handle the Air Force's most challenging missions. The transformation hadn't been easy or painless. She had lost friends who couldn't understand her willingness to challenge authority. She had faced months of uncertainty about her career and her future. But she had also discovered something invaluable. The knowledge that when everything else fell away, when regulations and politics and personal consequences became irrelevant, she could trust herself to make the right choice. That evening, Rachel sat in her quarters writing a letter to the families of Alpha 7, updating them on the unit's successful deployment and her own career progression. It had become a monthly tradition, a way of maintaining the connection forged in those desperate hours over Hades Gate. As she sealed the last envelope, Rachel's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown sender. The text was brief, but clear. New mission requires Hades Gate expertise. Deploy immediately to classified location. Bring your best people. Rachel smiled as she read the message. Somewhere in the world, another impossible mission was waiting for someone willing to fly into the storm. Another group of operators was counting on air support from pilots who understood that sometimes the only way forward was straight through the danger. She picked up her phone and began calling her squadron members, knowing that every one of them would volunteer for whatever challenge lay ahead. They had trained for this moment, prepared for the kind of mission that separated exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. Outside her window, Iron Storm sat on the flight line, ready for another impossible mission. The aircraft had been upgraded with new equipment and weapon systems, but its essential character remained unchanged, a machine built for punishment, designed to survive what would destroy lesser aircraft. Rachel packed her gear with the methodical precision of someone who had done this many times before, but also with the excitement of a pilot heading into unknown territory. The next mission would be different from Hades Gate, but the principles would be the same. Trust your training, read the terrain, adapt to conditions, and never give up on the people counting on you. as she drove toward the flight line in the pre-dawn darkness. Rachel reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. It had started with a choice between following orders and doing what was right, and it had evolved into a career dedicated to proving that impossible was just another word for difficult. Colonel Brennan had been wrong about many things, but he had been right about one. Rachel Coleman was the type of pilot who thought she knew better than her commanding officers. The difference was that she had been willing to prove it when lives were on the line, regardless of the personal cost. Now, as she prepared for another mission into terrain that maps marked as no-fly zones, Rachel knew that she had found her true calling, not just as a pilot, but as a leader who understood that sometimes the most important battles were fought not against external enemies, but against the internal voices that whispered about acceptable losses and prudent choices. Iron Storm waited in the darkness, ready to carry her into whatever storm lay ahead. And for the first time in her career, Rachel was flying with the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, at the tip of the spear, leading from the front, proving that there were no limits to what could be accomplished when courage met capability in the hands of someone willing to risk everything for the mission. The thunder was calling, and Rachel Coleman was ready to answer. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.